Now that we've talked through how we tap into and improve the emotional elements, let's talk through how we improve the logical appeals. As a reminder, there's 4 different types of logical appeals. Features, about what the product does, statistics, facts and figures, reliability, as well as price. But we need to remember a few important things. Our logical brain is very lazy. It's constantly looking for shortcuts. It's easily depleted because it requires the full focus and energy in order to process. And most importantly, because of 1 and 2, it gets overwhelmed. And so we want to restrict ourselves to really focusing on 3 to 4 pieces of logic around our flows at any given point in time. In terms of difficulty and impact, when we compare it to emotion, working on the logical appeals actually has lower impact, but it's also much easier to work on. It's a much more concrete thing that we're used to thinking about. So how do we identify and strengthen the most compelling logical appeals? Once again, our logical brain is easily depleted and easily overwhelmed. And so we want to make sure that we're identifying the strongest elements of logic and focusing on those rather than trying to throw everything against the wall to see what sticks. Here we can use our max diff surveys that we went through the monetization module again. So what we would do is run a survey across users and ask them, what do they find the most valuable and least valuable in terms of the feature set? What will be identified are really the 3 strongest features or 4 strongest features or elements that we want to focus on. We can use this exact same type of survey with more than just features. We could ask them, what kind of statistic do they find the most compelling and the least compelling as well, to figure out what facts and figures we should be putting in front of them that really drives them towards the action without overwhelming them. Additionally, we want to make sure that when we think about the logical appeals, that we're connecting it to the emotion that we're trying to invoke. So here on LifeLock, the key emotion that they're trying to evoke is concern and a little bit of fear around identity theft protection. So we see that in the visuals and the copy, but we can also see that in the logical appeals. The facts and figures that they use, like over half of consumers have experienced a data breach, or that a major credit bureau recently experienced a breach impacting about 143 million people, clearly support the emotion that they're trying to evoke as the core element. After we think through how do we improve the logical appeals, let's talk a little bit about how we improve the motivation step of the Reforge Elmo framework. As a reminder, we need to consider it on 2 dimensions, not just motivation, but ability. The 2 kind of relate to each other. So the easier it is to do something or the easier the decision, the less ability needed, meaning that the smaller the decision hill is, meaning the less motivation is required to complete the decision. And of course, the vice versa is true. The more ability needed in order to complete an action or decision, the steeper the hill, and therefore the more motivation that's required in order to complete the decision. We talked through in an earlier section about the Fogg behavior model, which was created by expert around behavior change, BJ Fogg, where he talks about the activation threshold and understanding where our user might be on this graph in order whether they complete or don't complete the action. There's 5 different abilities, things that can either make the hill steeper or less steep. Time, so how long does it take to complete an action? Money, how much is the financial cost to complete the action? Social, so is this an accepted behavior by others? Routine, does it match or disrupt our existing routines around things? As well as thought, how much thought is required in order to complete an action? So getting over the decision hill and the motivation step comes down to thinking through 3 different steps: the physical friction, the cognitive friction, and then adding motivational boosts. Let's start with the first step. How can you reduce physical friction? So what we're trying to do here is ultimately decrease the size of the hill. Because if we decrease the size of the hill, then we don't need to do anything to the motivational fuel. The lower the hill, the lower the amount of motivational fuel required to get them over the hill. So in terms of reducing that friction, it kind of is here on our 2x2 grid. It's a little bit tougher to improve than something like laying out our logical appeals. But when we do reduce that physical friction, it tends to have a pretty decent impact on our overall performance. The second thing we would want to think through is reducing cognitive friction. So we want to understand, where do users have confusion or question along the way in these key action flows? You can see that Gusto does an amazing job in their onboarding flow in terms of onboarding a new small business owner into using their payroll system. We come across a lot of different things and a lot of things that we might not be familiar with on a day-to-day basis. As you can see here, the ETT rate. So rather than leaving it up to the user to figure that out on their own, they provide a helpful tooltip with a link in order to check out more, as well as a very targeted message in the lower right-hand corner if I still don't understand what that thing is. Here we're reducing that cognitive friction, so we're reducing the size of that decision hill as we reduce that friction. As we reduce friction, we want to do that first, but once we do that, we need to think about, can we add motivational boosts or motivational fuel? We think through this last because, once again, if they don't have the core emotion or desire to complete the action or make that decision, then adding and layering on a bunch of motivational boosts isn't really going to help anyways. Adding motivational boosts tends to be pretty easy, but it also is a little bit lower on the impact scale when compared to the other things that we can focus on. In order to add motivational boosts, we would refer back to the motivational boost menu that we've put together for you. You can go through each type of boost from trust to urgency to scarcity to bargain and understand, are there specific tactics within that bucket that you can use to layer on to that step in your flow. As an example, once again, Amazon product page uses all sorts of these different elements. But it's not just e-commerce where we can use these motivational boosts. Here is a subscribe CTA to a content presence or a blog for a B2B product. We can see a number of motivational boosts at play. Here we see bargain, so get the cheat sheet with a bonus material, right? So I'm getting more for subscribing, as well as in the lower left-hand corner, a little bit slight nudge towards urgency in the terms of send it to me now. We can also see this in the case of the Wealthfront invite a friend example, right? They're displaying the clear monetary value that you're going to get for inviting a friend, so getting a bargain, as well as they're invoking trust by showing you the exact message that they're going to send to your friend in case you might be a little bit wary about what is going to be sent. So a recap of improving motivation. What we want to do is start by thinking through and reducing physical friction, because that tends to have the best ratio of difficulty to impact out of the few areas. We then want to think through how we reduce cognitive friction. Reducing cognitive friction can be a little bit more difficult to identify, but has a pretty good impact. Last but not least, we want to think about layering on those motivational boosts. We think about that last because, once again, removing friction typically has higher impact, and we can't just layer on motivational boosts at random. We need to make sure that there's that core emotional fuel there that is moving users through the Reforge Elmer decision hill. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about this last step, about how do we improve the elements of rewards.